Abraham, the father of faith who pimped his wife and created the Middle East crisis. They call him the father of faith, but what they don't tell you is that Abraham was also a serial liar, a coward who sold his wife twice to save his own skin, and the man whose failures created conflicts that still tear the Middle East apart today. This is the uncomfortable truth about one of history's most revered figures. A man so flawed that his story reads more like a scandal than a saint's biography. Yet it's precisely because of these shocking failures that Abraham's story reveals the most radical truth in all of Scripture. God's grace does not depend on our goodness. The Coward's Playbook: How to Prostitute Your Wife and Call It Strategy. Abraham didn't just lie once about his wife, he turned deception into a lifestyle. For 23 years, from the moment they left their homeland until his final recorded lie, Abraham and Sarah had a standing agreement. Wherever they traveled, she would pretend to be his sister. This wasn't panic-driven deception, it was premeditated, strategic betrayal. The first recorded incident happened in Egypt during a famine. Abraham's logic was coldly calculating. Kings would kill him to take his beautiful wife, but they might spare him if they thought she was just his sister. So he instructed Sarah to lie, essentially pimping her out to Pharaoh to protect himself. The plan worked exactly as Abraham feared and hoped. Pharaoh took Sarah into his harem, and Abraham received payment in livestock and servants. While his wife faced potential rape and adultery, Abraham counted his profits. What makes this even more disturbing is that Abraham was willing to risk not just his wife's purity, but God's entire redemptive plan. The Messiah was supposed to come through Abraham and Sarah's lineage. If Sarah had been permanently defiled or married another man, Christmas and Easter would have been cancelled. Abraham's cowardice literally threatened the salvation of the world. God had to intervene supernaturally, sending plagues on Pharaoh's house to rescue Sarah from the situation her own husband had created. The pagan king, horrified to discover he'd been deceived, showed more moral integrity than the supposed man of God. Pharaoh's rebuke cut deep. "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" Abraham was expelled from Egypt in disgrace, having brought curse instead of blessing to the nations. The lie that became a lifestyle. Any rational person would think that such humiliation would cure Abraham of his deceptive ways. Instead, it became his standard operating procedure. 25 years later, at nearly 100 years old, Abraham repeated the exact same sin with King Abimelech of Gerar. Same lie, same cowardice, same willingness to sacrifice his wife's honor for his own safety. This time, Abraham tried to justify his deception with technicalities. Sarah was technically his half-sister, he claimed, so he wasn't really lying. But omitting the crucial fact that she was primarily his wife made his defense even more worse. Abraham revealed that this was not situational panic. It was their agreed-upon strategy at every place they went. For over 2 decades, they had been professional deceivers. The pattern reveals something chilling about Abraham's character. He was a repeat offender. His faith worked fine when there was no visible threat, but the moment danger appeared, he abandoned trust in God's promises and reverted to manipulation. The man who could hear God's voice clearly couldn't bring himself to believe God would protect him. The generational curse of deception. Abraham's lies didn't just damage his own integrity, they infected his family line like a spiritual virus. His son Isaac, having grown up watching his father's cowardly behavior, committed the exact same sin. When Isaac faced potential danger over his beautiful wife Rebekah, he told the same lie about her being his sister. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. But the damage went deeper than copycat behavior. Abraham's pattern of deception created a family culture where manipulation was normalized. His grandson Jacob became a master deceiver, lying to his blind father to steal his brother's blessing. The poisonous seeds Abraham planted grew into generational patterns of distrust, competition, and betrayal. Abraham had failed in his most fundamental responsibility as a patriarch, to model faith and integrity for the next generation. Instead of using his failures as teaching moments, he apparently never addressed them, allowing the same sins to multiply in his children. The silence around his shame became more destructive than the shame itself. The Hagar disaster. how impatience created modern warfare. If Abraham's lies were destructive, his next major failure would create consequences that reverberate through history to this day. God had promised Abraham a son through Sarah, but years crawled by with no sign of fulfillment. Sarah, humiliated by her barrenness and desperate to give Abraham an heir, proposed what seemed like a practical solution. Abraham should sleep with her Egyptian servant Hagar to produce the promised child. This wasn't unusual by the standards of their time. Barren women regularly offered their servants as surrogate mothers, but it was a complete abandonment of faith in God's specific promise. Sarah was essentially saying, God needs our help to fulfill his word. And Abraham, rather than leading spiritually or seeking God's guidance, simply agreed. He slept with Hagar, and Ishmael was conceived, and not through promise but through human presumption. The results were catastrophic. Hagar, now pregnant with Abraham's child, began to despise her barren mistress. Sarah, consumed by jealousy and shame, blamed Abraham for the situation she had created. The household exploded into conflict, bitterness, and abuse. Sarah treated Hagar so cruelly that the pregnant woman fled into the desert, preferring death to continued torment. When Isaac was finally born years later, the tensions only intensified. Sarah, now more possessive than ever, demanded that Abraham banish Hagar and teenage Ishmael permanently. She couldn't stand the thought of her son sharing any inheritance with the child of the servant. Abraham, torn between his wife's demands and his love for his firstborn son, eventually caved to Sarah's cruelty. He sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness with barely enough provisions to survive. The seeds of eternal conflict. Abraham's failure to trust God's timing and methods planted seeds that grew into nations locked in conflict. He sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness with barely enough provisions to survive. Ishmael became the father of Arab peoples, while Isaac became the father of the Jewish nation. The rivalry between these half-brothers, both loved by Abraham but treated vastly differently, established patterns of competition that have never been resolved. The Bible itself prophesied this outcome. Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. This wasn't a divine curse. It was the natural consequence of Abraham's faithless decision, creating a rejected son. The Middle East conflicts we see today, from Israel-Palestine tensions to broader Arab-Israeli hostilities, all trace back to that moment when Abraham chose expedience over faith. Think about the staggering scope of Abraham's failure. One act of impatience has resulted in thousands of years of warfare, millions of deaths, and ongoing instability that affects the entire world. Every suicide bombing, every missile attack, every peace treaty that fails carries echoes of Abraham's refusal to wait for God's perfect timing. The man behind the myth. Fear disguised as faith. What's most troubling about Abraham's failures is how they reveal the gap between his public reputation and private character. Outwardly, he appeared to be a man of tremendous faith, leaving his homeland at God's call, building altars, receiving divine visions. But privately, he was controlled by fear and doubt. Abraham's faith had a fatal flaw. It worked only when circumstances seemed manageable. When God spoke in visions and dreams, Abraham believed. But when real-world dangers appeared, famine, powerful kings, military threats, his faith crumbled. He knew God's promises intellectually, but couldn't trust God's character emotionally. This selective faith made Abraham spiritually schizophrenic. He could worship passionately one day and lie desperately the next. He could receive divine promises about becoming a great nation while simultaneously acting in ways that could destroy that very promise. The disconnect between what he believed about God and how he actually lived reveals the dangerous gap that exists in many believers' lives. Abraham's pattern was tragically consistent. Pray when safe, panic when threatened. He never seemed to learn that God's promises guaranteed his survival. After all, how could God make him into a great nation if he died childless? Logic should have told him he was immortal until Isaac's birth, but fear doesn't operate on logic. The devastating cost of compromised leadership. Abraham's failures weren't just personal. They had massive collateral damage. Every time he lied about Sarah, he brought divine judgment on innocent people. Pharaoh's entire household suffered plagues because of Abraham's deception. Abimelech and his people became sterile because they unknowingly took another man's wife. Abraham was supposed to be a blessing to the nations, but his lies brought curses instead. His family bore the worst consequences. Sarah experienced the trauma of being used as a bargaining chip, twice faced potential rape, and lived with the knowledge that her husband valued his life more than her honor. Hagar suffered abuse, abandonment, and the terror of dying in the desert. Ishmael grew up as the rejected son, carrying wounds that would shape entire civilizations. But perhaps most tragically, Abraham's compromises weakened his moral authority within his own household. When conflict arose between Sarah and Hagar, Abraham was too morally compromised to provide leadership. Instead of protecting both women and managing the crisis he had helped create, he abdicated responsibility. His response to Sarah's demand to banish Hagar was essentially, "Do whatever you want." This wasn't wisdom. It was the bankruptcy of a man who had lost the right to lead because he had failed to live with integrity. The scandalous grace that redeems failures. Here's what makes Abraham's story so shocking and so hopeful. God never abandoned him. Despite the lies, the cowardice, the family destruction, and the international incidents, God continued to work through Abraham. Every mess he made became an opportunity for divine grace to shine brighter. God's faithfulness to Abraham wasn't based on Abraham's performance. It was based on God's character. When Abraham failed, God didn't find a new patriarch. When Abraham's lies threatened the covenant, God didn't void the agreement. When Abraham's impatience created Ishmael, God didn't cancel Isaac. The Almighty simply absorbed the damage, worked around the failures, and continued pursuing his purposes through a deeply flawed man. This is the scandalous heart of grace. God's commitment to us doesn't fluctuate with our faithfulness to him. Abraham proves that divine calling isn't based on moral perfection. If it were, the Bible would be a very short book. Instead, God specializes in using broken people, redeeming their failures, and writing beautiful stories through cracked vessels. The transformation process, from coward to champion. Abraham's story doesn't end with his failures. It culminates in his greatest triumph. The same man who couldn't trust God to protect his life eventually trusted God enough to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah. This wasn't sudden transformation. It was gradual refinement through decades of experiencing God's faithfulness despite his own faithlessness. Each failure became a classroom where Abraham learned more about God's character. When he lied, and God still protected Sarah, he discovered that God's commitment to his promises was stronger than Abraham's commitment to truth. When he rushed ahead with Hagar, and God still provided Isaac, he learned that divine timing is perfect even when human timing is terrible. When his household fell apart, and God still maintained the covenant, he realized that God's grace is bigger than human failure. The Abraham who finally lifted the knife over Isaac was not the same man who had hidden behind half-truths in Egypt. Decades of failure and forgiveness had forged him into someone who could trust God's goodness, even when he couldn't understand God's ways. His faith had been refined in the fire of his own mistakes, the uncomfortable mirror. Abraham is us. The reason Abraham's story is so disturbing and so necessary is that it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We all have our Egyptian moments when fear overcomes faith. We all have situations where we manipulate rather than trust, scheme rather than surrender. We all create Ishmaels when we try to fulfill God's promises through our own methods. Abraham's failures are a mirror reflecting our own spiritual inconsistencies. How often do we worship on Sunday and worry on Monday? How many half-truths do we tell to protect ourselves? How frequently do we take matters into our own hands when God seems slow to act? Abraham's story strips away our religious pretenses and shows us what we really are, deeply flawed people in desperate need of grace. But that's exactly why his story is so hopeful. If God could use Abraham, liar, coward, family destroyer, international incident creator, then God can use anyone. If Abraham's failures couldn't disqualify him from God's purposes, then neither can ours. The patriarch's legacy isn't his perfection. It's proof that grace is stronger than failure, that God's faithfulness outlasts human faithlessness and that divine purposes triumph even through broken people. Abraham's story is ultimately not about a man who got his act together. It's about a God who never gives up on broken people. And in a world full of liars, cowards, and failures, that might be the most hopeful news of all.